Chapter 16. It wasn't the most comfortable seat Peter Parker had ever sat in. The cushion was threadbare and there was a spring that seemed determined to lacerate his left thigh. But for all that, it might as well have been a throne in Buckingham Palace for the sense of elation it gave him. Then again, a lot of things were making him feel that way lately. Over the past several days, he'd been doing nothing except being normal. He had done the big things, such as cleaning up his apartment so it was actually inhabitable once again. He had done the little things, such as buying a hot dog on a street corner. It was overpriced and overcooked, but he had never tasted anything quite as good. He had just resolved to wash it down with an egg cream, which contained, paradoxically, neither egg nor cream, when he'd heard sirens pass by. So ingrained was his behavior that he had reflexively started to move toward them. But he'd only taken a step when he remembered that his costume was gone. He, the web-swinging he, was gone. But instead of feeling tense or guilty, all he did was sigh, relax, and eat his hot dog. Later, he finished fixing his motorbike. Once he had done so, he rode it over to the campus, where he arrived in plenty of time for his science class. As Dr. Connors lectured, Peter felt more alert than ever before. At one point, Connors asked a particularly challenging question, and there were bewildered looks from the other students. Not from Peter, though. His hand shot up as if spring-loaded, and a visibly surprised Connors called on him, and grinned broadly when Peter provided the answer. After class, Connors had passed Peter in the hallway and, without slowing down, had said briskly, "Excellent work today, Parker. Keep it up." "Thanks," Peter had said. But Connors was already gone, moving too fast to hear him. It didn't matter, though. Now Peter was in the theater, in his somewhat uncomfortable chair, seated a row or two back from where he'd originally been supposed to sit the night when he'd let Mary Jane down. Again. But there would never be a recurrence. He felt like a recovering alcoholic, one who had seen his life swirling away and had tossed aside his addiction so he could salvage it. But there had been no substance abuse in his life. His addiction instead had been guilt. Its manifestation had been Spider-Man. It was over, though. The guilt was dealt with, the manifestation disposed of. Time to move on. Truth to tell, a mannered British drawing room farce wasn't his favorite way to spend the evening. But gazing at Mary Jane most certainly was. So he was willing to endure the former in order to spend time engaging in the latter. They were well into the second act when Algernon addressed Mary Jane's Cecily. "Oh," Algernon said dismissively, "I'm not really wicked at all, Cousin Cecily. You mustn't think that I am wicked." "If you are not," replied Mary Jane, "then you have certainly been deceiving us all in a very inexcusable manner." She walked across the stage as if she owned it. "I hope you have not been leading a double life, pretending to be wicked and being really good all the time." She leaned in toward the audience, delivering the line as a reproving aside. "That would be hypocrisy." Something about the way she delivered the line, and, of course, the literal wording of it, couldn't help but make Peter feel as if she were talking right to him. And then he realized that she almost was. Not intentionally at first, but from her vantage point upon the stage, she had suddenly realized that Peter was in the audience. He locked eyes with her and grinned ingratiatingly. Her eyes widened, and when Algernon declared, "Oh, of course, I have been rather reckless," he looked to Mary Jane for a response and got nothing. She continued to stare at Peter. Mary Jane, your cue?" Peter tried to give her silent signals, but she was just gaping at him. A bit louder, Algernon cleared his throat and said, "Are you glad to hear it?" Hearing her own line coming out of someone else's mouth snapped her back to attention. Quickly she said, "Oh, I am glad to hear it." She promptly got back into the swing of the play. But the object of her attention hadn't gone unnoticed. A young dude sitting next to Peter nudged him, and when Peter turned to look at him, mouthed, "You and her?" Peter bobbed his head in an indefinite manner. That was enough for the dude, who mouthed, "Sweet," and went back to watching the show. Peter grinned. He and Mary Jane. Why the hell not? He had been standing at the stage door waiting for her, and when she'd emerged, she looked genuinely happy to see him. He was so relieved, especially since her spotting him had thrown her out of character for a moment. Peter had felt particularly guilty over that. Then again, feeling guilty had become second nature for him at this point in his life. That was exactly the mindset he was trying to move beyond. As they strolled through Chinatown, Peter felt taller, more confident. He walked with his shoulders squared, spoke in a more relaxed manner. "You were so wonderful," he said. "That was such a great play." Well, she'd been great in it, at any rate. "You could have told me you were coming." A dozen excuses came to mind, but he shrugged them off and said the simple truth. "I was afraid you'd say don't come." She nodded, indicating to Peter that she might well have done so, seeing it as a desperate, too little too late gesture to make things up to her. "You look different," she said, sounding a bit guarded. "I shined my shoes," he said lightly. "Pressed my pants, did my homework. I do my homework now." He paused, then asked, "Would you like to get some chow mein?" She shook her head and sighed. "Peter, I'm getting married." "I know, I was there," he thought. But some part of him refused to accept it. "I always imagined you getting married on a hilltop." "And who's the groom?" He stopped and turned to face her, speaking as if he could reshape reality just by force of will. "You haven't decided yet." Slowly, she began to understand. "You think because you saw my play you can talk me out of getting married?" She sounded incredulous. That was more or less accurate. It did sound rather hopeless, though, the way she said it. The old Peter Parker would have crawled away, literally. But instead, he said forcefully, "You once told me you loved me. I let things get in the way before. There was something I..." He hated speaking in vague terms, but he was trying to leave that part of his life behind. Delving into it chapter and verse would only bring it forcefully to the forefront. "Something I thought I had to do. I don't have to now." "You're too late." "Will you think about it?" Her blue eyes stared at him in disbelief. She probably thought he was beginning to sound like a stalker. "Think about what?" "Picking up where we left off." Her arms akimbo, Mary Jane peered at him challengingly. "Where was that? We never got on. You can't get off if you don't get on, Peter." They both blinked at that. Clearly it hadn't come out quite right. "That sounded a lot less suggestive in my head before I actually said it," Mary Jane admitted, "but you know what I meant." Softly, Peter said, "I don't think it's that simple." "Of course you don't, because you complicate things. You don't understand. I'm not an empty seat anymore." When she smiled slightly, Peter was convinced that he was making some headway. He angled a shoulder toward her and said, "I'm different now. Punch me, I bleed." As far as pleas for empathy went, it wasn't exactly the "hath not a Jew eyes" speech, but it was the best he was going to be able to do under the circumstances. Unfortunately, it didn't appear to be enough. "I've got to go," Mary Jane said after a long pause. She backed up, flagging an approaching cab. As it glided toward her, she continued to face Peter. "I'm getting married in a church." He shrugged in his most non-committal, "we'll see" manner. The cab came to a stop. She opened the door and, just before she stepped in, studied him a few moments more. "You are different," she decided. She got in and closed the door behind her. The cab pulled away. Peter stood there, watching it go. He ran the conversation back through his mind, studied it with a strangely detached, clinical air. What he kept coming back to was that in between all her protests about getting married and it being too late, she seemed to be pausing an awful long time, as if the answers weren't coming easily to her, as if she had to think about them real hard. Which meant Something. He smiled, and the smile spread into a grin. It was a start. The euphoric mood of his encounter with Mary Jane carried him all the way through to the following morning at the university. Eschewing the bike, which, despite his repairs, had stalled out several times on his last sojourn with it, he decided to take the subway. His backpack slung over his shoulder, he emerged from the station along with a stream of students. He realized that's all he was. Just one of the students. Nothing special, nothing to see here. Just keep moving. He passed by one of the dorms and stopped, noticing movement down an alleyway, between two of the buildings. There were 3 extremely unsavory types lurking there. They were unshaven, their clothes dirty from being slept in, their hair scraggly and matted. If he got close enough, he was sure they'd stink. The larger 2 guys were ganging up on the third. The third was cowering as they rifled his pockets and grabbed at a bag. It appeared to be a rumpled Bloomingdale's bag that he was clutching. Drugs. Probably drugs, he assured himself. Or booze. Or a battered teddy bear that once belonged to his dead daughter who died young and that's why he started drinking. Or he took a deep breath, let it out, and kept walking. Move along. Nothing to see here. Chapter 17. Shouldn't anniversaries be for celebrating things? Shouldn't we just set those aside for that specific reason? Those thoughts floated through Peter's mind as he stood next to his aunt near the grave of Uncle Ben. It was a sunny day, but unseasonably cool and crisp. Aunt May, clutching a small bunch of violets, stared at the grave for some time without saying a word. Peter's hand rested just below her head. He didn't say a word. 2 years. 2 years to the day that his Uncle Ben had been gone. There had never been any doubt in Peter's mind that he would join Aunt May for this private little ceremony. And yet, until he was actually there, he'd wondered if he would have the strength to go through with it. Contradictory, but then he was a study in contradictions. As he drew his coat closer around himself, he watched as Aunt May stepped away from him and approached the grave. She set the violets upon the ground, then stepped back and shook her head slowly. "It wasn't fair to have gone that way," she said softly. "He was a peaceful man." She took a deep breath and exhaled 3 words that Peter couldn't quite believe she was saying. "It's my fault." He shook his head, wanting to tell her how wrong she was, but the words froze in his throat. She didn't notice the look of conflict that played across his face. Her attention was intent upon the grave, and when she turned and headed back to the waiting taxi, Peter simply followed without saying a thing. They didn't speak all the way to the house, and as Aunt May busied herself in the kitchen, Peter sat at the table and stared at the place where Uncle Ben had always sat. Once upon a time, he would have been able to imagine Ben sitting there. Perhaps Ben would even start scolding him, as his ghost had been wont to do lately. Now, though, there was nothing. Just an empty space and an empty chair. He had banished Ben Parker's hauntings from his mind. And apparently, Ben had set up shop in Aunt May's. Peter had been feeling so good about himself lately. Having made the deliberate decision to leave behind him that symbol of ongoing guilt, Spiderman, he was happier and more at peace than he'd been in months. He had achieved closure, finally. His aunt, though, not only hadn't achieved that state of mind, but she appeared to be backsliding. She blamed herself? The more Peter dwelled on it, the more incredulous he became. How could she possibly blame herself? She'd been sitting at home, uninvolved in any of it. By the time he heard the tea kettle issuing its high-pitched summons, he knew he had to do something. He couldn't let it fester this way. He had to find some means to put her mind at rest. He entered the kitchen, and Aunt May gestured for him to sit at the table. He did so and watched as she brought over the steeping tea. Tentatively, he told her, "You don't have to punish yourself, Aunt May." She looked up at him with a brief display of confusion, but then she understood. As she sat opposite him, she spoke in a very calm and distant manner, with no trace of emotion or mourning in her voice. "Oh, I know I shouldn't. But if I had kept out of it..." When she saw his puzzled expression, she said, "You wanted to take the subway, and I told him to drive you." So that was it. When they had left the house that night, Peter had been certain he'd seen Uncle Ben after insisting on driving Peter into the city, winking at Aunt May. He hadn't known the significance of it then, but now he did. She'd told Ben what to do, and he was winking at her in satisfaction that he'd accomplished it. May was shaking her head now. If I'd just kept my mouth shut, we'd all be having tea together. Well, that was that, wasn't it? Thanks to Peter's ignoble actions, not only had this poor woman lost her husband, she was going to spend the rest of her life beating herself up over it. "I want to thank you very, very much for coming today," she said. But Peter barely heard her, because his mind was racing toward a conclusion that he had once found to be both untenable and yet inevitable. She couldn't go through the rest of her years thinking this way. It wasn't right or fair that Aunt May, who had done nothing to Peter except be the best mother figure she could manage, should have to suffer like this, all because of him. She needed closure as well. Perhaps even more than he did. "I have to tell you something, Aunt May," he said, forcing the words out as if he were choking on them. "Something you won't want to hear. Something I couldn't tell you until now. Not couldn't. Didn't want to. But I've no choice now." "What's wrong, Peter?" she asked. She'd been stirring her tea, but now she put the spoon down. "Are you in trouble?" "You could say that," he admitted. "You see..." He steadied himself, praying that she would understand why he was doing this and appreciate the gesture. "You see, I'm responsible." She stared at him blankly. "For what? What are you talking about?" "For what happened to Uncle Ben." Obviously, at that point, she thought she did understand, because she smiled and shook her head, patting him affectionately on the hand. "Peter, you're trying to make me feel better," she said, which was more or less true as far as it went. The problem was that she couldn't comprehend just how far that was, as she quickly made clear. "You went to the library. You were doing your homework." "I didn't go to the library." "What do you mean?" Peter's mind was desperately trying to catch up with his mouth. He sure as hell didn't want to give her all the gory details, so he tried to edit the story as much as he could while still having it all make sense. "Uncle Ben drove me to the library, but I never went in. He waited for me outside, but I went someplace else. Someplace to make some money to buy myself a car." She looked confused, clearly failing to understand how Peter's being duplicitous about going to the library could possibly relate to the death of her beloved Ben. Peter rushed ahead, trying to avoid having the words spill all over one another. "I wanted to impress someone, but I was taken advantage of, and there was a robbery, and I was getting revenge." Still a blank expression from May. Still she didn't understand. Hitting each word for emphasis, he said, I could have stopped the thief, but I let him go. I even held the door for him. And Uncle Ben was waiting. She didn't move, not so much as a centimeter, but the pupils in her eyes seemed to dilate, as if some potent narcotic had just hit her system, or her brain had been assaulted by more information than it was prepared to process. Then he stole Uncle Ben's car, Peter finished, somewhat unnecessarily. First he shot him. For a long, long time, she said nothing. The only sound in the house was the steady tick of the pendulum in the grandfather clock from the living room. "I'm so sorry," said Peter. And never before had those words seemed so inadequate, not even when he'd said them to Mary Jane for the umpteenth time. "I couldn't keep it a secret no more," she said abruptly, and she stood. "Aunt May, He reached over to take her hand, and she yanked it away as if he were a snake about to sink his fangs into it. She got to her feet and warned, "Don't touch me now." Quickly, she moved past him to the stairs. He waited for the outburst of emotion, but it didn't come. Instead, she walked slowly up to the top of the stairs, and then disappeared down the short hallway. Peter remained where he was, wondering what to do. He kept trying to tell himself that he had done the right thing. Aunt May had been hurting, and she had to know. Then a sound came from the top of the stairs. Sobbing. She was crying bitterly, and Peter was at war with himself whether to go up the stairs or not. Abruptly, the decision was taken from his hands as May appeared at the top of the stairs. Her eyes were red, her face wet, but she was completely composed. "I need to be alone," she said, reining in whatever was going through her mind. Peter began. It was, "Go!" She had never screamed at him like that before. The scream of a broken soul. He got out, sprinting toward his bike, which was parked in the driveway. He vaulted onto it and started it up. It only took 5 tries. It coughed somewhat, and then he steered it away, all the time realizing the truth of what had just transpired. Peter had told himself that he was telling Aunt May about what happened so that she could find closure. But that hadn't been true at all. Simply knowing that Peter was involved in the events that led to Ben's murder wasn't going to make things better for her. Peter's actions didn't change the fact that May had sent Ben Parker out to his fate. She was likely going to continue beating herself up for that. No, the truth was, he'd been seeking absolution. He'd told Aunt May information that could not possibly have done her any good, and had done it in an act of unbridled selfishness. He'd told her what had transpired, as much as he could without letting her know of his double existence, however passé that was, because he wanted her to tell him that it was all right, that she still loved him despite his horrific mistake. He'd wanted her to pat him on the head, tell him that she still loved him, and that it was going to be all right, that he should go and sin no more. Instead, this debacle had ensued, because he'd been selfish. Thank God he wasn't a hero anymore. Betty Brandt, executive secretary to J. Jonah Jameson, stared at the costume without comprehending it first. The bum was holding it half out of the Bloomingdale's shopping bag that he'd stuffed it in. His face was somewhat triangular, and his eyebrows were thick and upswept. His long hair obscured his ears, and he had a shapeless brown hat drawn down over his head. People were coming and going in the building lobby, oblivious to what was transpiring, as Betty continued to look at it. She started to reach for it, but the man snatched it away from her, shoving it back into the bag. The stocky building guard said tentatively, "You see why I called you down here, Miss Brandt? I mean, every day of the week I give guys like this the bum's rush." "No offense," he assured the bum. "None taken," he said. The guard continued, Thing is, Mr. Homeless American brings this thing in, and, well, I know the thing Mr. Jameson has for... He lowered his voice and glanced around. You know who. And I'm figuring if this is the genuine article, he'd want to know about it. Let me see it again, Betty said. Cost you $5 for a look. Take a hike, said Betty, and she turned to leave. All right, snapped the homeless man, and he pulled it out again for her to study. She looked at it closely, studying it. She'd seen the cheap Halloween costume knockoffs that had been manufactured in China, but she'd also seen countless close-up photographs across her desk, thanks to Peter Parker. By this point, she felt she knew Spider-Man's costume better than she did most of her own outfits. And this thing, it looked real. Seemed real. She stared very closely at it again, and again. And sure enough, very faintly but still there, she saw what appeared to be blood stains. The costume had been washed repeatedly and the stains had faded, but there was still the slightest hint of them, if one was looking for them. Whoever had worn this costume had been in a fight, or more than one. The bum pulled it back into the bag and then looked at her expectantly. As if anticipating her question, he said, It's real, all right. Found it in a garbage can. See these bruises? And he pointed to swelling under his right eye and at his left temple. Got it from fighting two guys who were bigger than me, 'cause they tried to take it away. Guys like me don't get into a scrape over a fake Spider-Man costume. Wandered around for 2 days with it, wondering what the best way was to make a score off it. Tried these TV news people, but I couldn't get past the reception desk. Wouldn't give me the time of day. Finally figured you guys were the best way to go. So did I figure right? He asked challengingly. She turned to the guard. Give him a visitor's pass. Want me to come up with you? Asked the guard. No, she said automatically, but then looked at the leering homeless man and said, yes. She found she had to hold her breath on the ride up in the elevator. She tried to be sympathetic to the plight of this poor, destitute individual, but finally Betty decided she was more concerned with not losing her lunch. She'd never been so grateful for the opening of a set of elevator doors as she was when they arrived on the 35th floor. Reporters looked at her in confusion and even backed away as she walked briskly with the bum in tow, while he clutched his Bloomies bag and looked suspiciously around. As she approached Jameson's office, she saw that Hoffman and Robbie were already in there, trying to get Jameson's attention and extract a decision about something or other. She wondered why they even had their own offices, considering the amount of time they spent in Jonah's. Jameson himself was on the phone, and probably was annoyed that he'd had to answer it himself, since Betty was away from her desk. She'd likely have to endure another 5-minute rant from him over the evils of voicemail. His voice easily carried to her as she approached. We agreed to put on a wedding, not go into bankruptcy, he shouted. Caviar? Are we inviting the Tsar? Get some cheese and crackers, and maybe some of those little cocktail weenies. Then he paused, listening again. Flowers? How much? Spend any more on this thing, you can pick the daisies off my grave. Get plastic. JJ, Betty said, sticking her head in. There's a man here. He says he has something you might want. Jameson looked past his secretary at the man standing behind her, and for once he actually appeared puzzled. But then it obviously occurred to both him and Robertson that if Betty was bringing this man to his attention, there had to be some legitimate reason, unfathomable though it may be. Cautiously, Jonah waved him in. The bum displayed his bag, and Jameson said with trepidation, I hope you don't have the head of an extraterrestrial in there, because if you do, you're the third guy this week. No, sir, the homeless man said proudly. What's your story? The bum pulled the costume out of the bag and placed it in a rumpled heap on the desk. Jameson couldn't take his eyes off it. Where the hell did you get that? He asked. His voice sounded strange, and Betty realized he wasn't breathing. I found it in the trash. Jameson held the costume up, shook it out by the shoulders. He turned it side to side, and Betty knew he was giving it the same meticulous inspection she had. And if there was one person who had stared at pictures of the genuine costume more than Betty, it was Jameson. He'd actually encountered the web-slinger in person during that messy green goblin business. She watched as the skepticism in Jonah's eyes gave way to mounting disbelief that he could possibly be holding such an object in his hands. And this, in turn, melded into such excitement that his mouth moved several times before he could manage to form any words. "He's out," whispered Jonah, which was a first as far as Betty could recall, since Jonah Jameson never, ever spoke below a bellow in his office. And then his voice began to escalate in volume until every pair of eyes in the newsroom was fixed upon him. "He's given up! Thrown in the towel! Abandoned his sad masquerade!" He whirled the costume around in an approximation of a tango driven from pure joy, and suddenly he stopped in mid-motion. "Just like that lowlife to quit on me," he snapped angrily, staring at the costume with the fury of an abandoned lover. "He was the best damn newspaper-selling lunatic the city ever had!" Mister," said the homeless man tentatively. "I'm awful hungry, mister." "I'll give you $50, said Jameson. Betty couldn't believe it. It was worth thousands. Hell, tens of thousands if he could get it authenticated somehow and put up for auction. "I figured 100, replied the homeless man, which only astounded Betty more. And Jameson, the millionaire publisher, countered with 75. Immediately, the homeless man bobbed his head in acceptance. Betty wanted to thwap him on the side of the head in order to smack some sense into him, but Jameson was already saying, "Miss Brandt, give this man his money, and throw in a bar of soap." "Soap. Got it, JJ," said Betty. She gestured for the homeless man to follow her, and he did so obediently. Out at her desk, she wrote out a cash voucher and handed it to the homeless man. "Take the gentleman to payroll," she told the guard, "and cash this in for him." The homeless man looked at the voucher and blinked. "Lady, you wrote an extra 0. She stared at him, her eyes level, and said, "I doubt that. I never make a mistake like that," in a very flat tone. She made no effort to take the voucher back, though. A slow smile spread over the face of the guard, and then he harumphed and said to the indigent, "You heard Miss Brandt. She'd never make a mistake writing down a number. Let's go cash this in." At last the homeless man got the message. To Betty's surprise, he bowed in a courtly manner. "Thank you," he said, and then he leaned forward and said very intently, "I used to be someone, you know. I just can't remember who." "Maybe you were Santa Claus, or the King of Atlantis," suggested the guard. The homeless man pulled at his thick beard thoughtfully. "King of Atlantis. Sounds good. I like that." And he allowed the guard to lead him away. Betty was ready to defend her mistake to Jonah Jameson, but as it turned out, he didn't notice it. In fact, he was in an insanely good mood for the rest of the day, and well into the evening. However, as good a mood as he was in, Betty couldn't take seriously the night shift personnel who claimed that Jonah Jameson had, with his blinds closed and convinced that no one was paying attention, slipped on the Spider-Man suit and cavorted around his office, striking heroic poses. Why, Betty knew that it was just preposterous. Jameson may have been many things, but that much of a lunatic? No. There was only so much that even Betty Brandt would believe of her boss. Although she did wonder the next day why there were footprints on the top of Jonah's desk and strings of paper clips hanging from the office lamp, looking for all the world like metal strands of webbing. Chapter 18. Doc Ock kept his coat drawn tightly around himself as he approached the newsstand from where he obtained most of his sustenance lately. He was keeping a low profile these days, taking no chances of someone finding him out. He'd been fortunate to discover this particular newsstand, only a few blocks from the pier. It was as seedy as the general area, and the guy who ran it was about 80% blind. Plus, policemen rarely drove through on patrol. The neighborhood was so shabby. Since the newsstand owner's vision was so poor, he couldn't really see much of Ock, which suited the doctor just fine. For his part, Ock was practically living on the assortment of corn chips and candy bars the newsstand had to offer. It reminded him of his college days, when such diets were the norm. Considering that he developed his first greatest ideas back then, perhaps there was something to his collegiate food selection. Normally, he barely glanced at the newspapers when he carried out one of his food runs, but this particular dreary day, his gaze was swiftly captured by the Daily Bugle headline blaring at him from the front page, "Spider-Man No More." One of his metal arms instinctively stirred under his coat, trying to reach for a copy, but Ock batted it away and took the paper himself. He bought it with his other purchases and scanned the story on the way back to the pier. By the time he had reached the warehouse, he decided he wasn't satisfied with the story. Not at all. In the first place, it had eclipsed his own press. The headline reading, "Manhunt Continues for Tentacled Terrorist," took a distant back seat to this latest development with Spider-Man. In the second place, Doc Ock didn't trust it. As he returned to work on his project, his tentacles maneuvering the fourth and final crescent into place, he had to think that if there wasn't a body, there was no proof. This entire story appeared to hinge on the Bugle having acquired a Spider-Man costume alleged to be the genuine article. But without a dead Spider-Man inside the costume to provide some manner of verification, all the paper really had was the publisher's conviction that the costume wasn't a hoax. In time, thought Ock, this costume might be relegated to the same historic dustbin that held Piltdown Man in the Hitler Diaries. Interestingly, according to the article, the district attorney's office was trying to gain possession of the costume so they could practically tear the thing apart in a detailed forensic search. Jameson wouldn't hear of it, though, and his attorneys were fighting the attempts with every tooth in their shark-like mouths. Ultimately, Doc Ock didn't really care what Spider-Man's status was. If he was still a threat, Ock would dispose of him. If he wasn't, then of what consequence was he? No. The only thing that truly mattered was the fusion reactor. The tentacle arms twisted and curled around Ock as he stepped back to survey the progress.
"Is it there yet, Father?"
He chuckled at that. How like children to ask such questions. No concept of patience. "Yes, almost complete," he said aloud to the voice in his head. "And what we need now is the tritium that will enable the core. Only Osborn, that little jellyfish, knows where it is."
"He cannot stand between us, Father. He is a weakling."
"Yes," Ock said, smiling. "He's a weakling. And there are ways to deal with weaklings." Harry Osborn stood near an open window in his Manhattan townhouse, a drink in his hand. He heard an exceedingly annoying voice floating up from the street, singing an equally annoying song. "Spider-Man, Spider-Man, where did you go to, Spider-Man?" He glanced out the window and saw a young Japanese violinist sitting there, performing the mournful dirge. Without hesitation, Harry upended the drink and watched with some pleasure as it descended upon the head of the street singer. He was quite satisfied with the yelp he heard, and moments later the violinist moved along. Unfortunately, that left Harry without a drink. Equally unfortunately, that didn't really present a problem. He walked, or lurched slightly, over to his father's liquor cabinet. Or rather, Harry's liquor cabinet. He had trouble thinking of it that way. And poured himself a shot of scotch, straight up. He downed it in one gulp and gasped as the liquid heat cascaded down his throat. Once upon a time, he would have coughed it up, unable to handle it. It was amazing what he was able to handle these days. He steadied himself, leaning against the bar a moment, and then poured himself another. There, in what had been his father's private office, except it's mine now, Harry once again had to remind himself. He flopped down onto a chair and swirled the drink idly in the glass. Funny. On the rare occasions that he'd ventured in here, the place had seemed majestic, filled with energy and purpose. Now that it was his, it seemed smaller. Edmund Bernard, or simply Bernard as he preferred to be called, entered the room stiffly. Bernard had been his father's houseman, and now worked for Harry. He had been with the family for ages. Getting rid of him would have been unthinkable, which was probably why Harry thought about it whenever Bernard entered his field of vision. He glared balefully across the room at Bernard, who entered with some papers that Harry had to look over and sign before the morning. As Harry took them, he watched Bernard stare straight at the desk and the assortment of papers scattered there. Even the most cursory of glances would have revealed that the papers were almost exclusively photos and news clippings about Spider-Man. "I'm leaving for the night, sir," Bernard said, and then pausing, added in a voice tinged with regret, "Your father only obsessed over his work." "Good night, Bernard," Harry said coldly. He felt as if Bernard was regarding him with a combination of fear and disgust. Bernard turned on his heel and left. A few moments later, the door slammed. "See you tomorrow," Harry added, voice barely above a whisper. He rose from his chair and tottered over toward the desk, leaning against it until the world around him stopped swirling. There was a file photo of Spider-Man in the latest issue of the Bugle, accompanying some ridiculous article that claimed Spider-Man had quit. The photo had a large red X stenciled over it, and the words, "Where are you?" had been scrawled by Harry in big red letters. Spider-Man quitting. What a stupid notion. Spider-Man would never back off or back down. As near as Harry could tell, it was the Wallcrawler's mission, for whatever reason, to destroy the Osborns one person, one experiment, one life at a time. Anything was possible. Perhaps he was some disgruntled former employee. Oscorp had tons of those. Or perhaps he'd been hired by Oscorp's main rival, Quest. Harry clenched his fists angrily. There had to be a reason, a rationale. All Harry had to do was keep looking, and he could surely find the reason that Spider-Man was trying to make life a living hell for anyone named Osborn. He wandered out onto the balcony, still holding the drink. He was in shirt sleeves, and barefoot to boot. Well, there was one way to try and boost the temperature. He drank yet another shot of scotch, and felt a cheery, warming sensation spreading through his blood. Ah, yes, this was definitely the life. The lifestyle of the rich and famous. That was when he heard what sounded like a distant thump. He glanced around, wondering where it had come from. Then a second thump, only closer this time, and louder. Then some crunches, a whirring, an assortment of noises originating from below the balcony, out of his field of vision. He moved cautiously toward the railing. Clutching it firmly, he looked over the edge. He looked right, then left, trying to figure out from which direction, if any, the sounds were coming, whatever they might be. He leaned slightly past the edge, trying to see underneath. And suddenly, some sort of thick steel cable unspooled straight up at him. He flinched, getting his head out of the way just in time, but the thing knocked the glass out of his hand, sending it flying. It was at that instant that he recognized the cable for what it was, and he stumbled backwards. A symphony of thumping and crunching and whirring sounds enveloped him as the mechanical arms climbed steadily up the side of the townhouse, seemingly in slow motion, their master hanging in the middle with his real arms folded confidently. Harry's back was against the wall, and yet he still kept pushing against it, as if he hoped he would be able to pass through it, ghost-like. The telephone was 10 feet away, but it might as well have been 10 miles for all that he could get to it, since the way was blocked by one of those steel tentacles. Like a ghoul emerging from its grave, the man once known as Octavius, but now referred to by everyone in the city as Doc Ock, rose into view over the railing. One of the tentacles thrust toward Harry like a javelin. He let out a shriek, convinced that this was the end, and then to his shock he realized that all of this had happened in a matter of seconds. Even his glass hadn't yet hit the ground, and the pincers at the end of the tentacle deftly snatched it out of mid-air. As Doc Ock stared down at Harry, the pincer moved toward Ock and handed him the glass. "Hello, Harry," he said with surprising softness. Harry managed to gasp out, "Octavius, what do you want?" Doc Ock looked mildly astonished that Harry would have to ask so self-evident a question. "A drink," he said, gesturing to the glass suspended in front of him. Another tentacle brought him the bottle of scotch, and Ock poured himself a glass. Lifting it in a mock salute, he drank it, smacking his lips and savoring the taste. Then he threw the glass to the floor, smashing it. "And something," he continued, almost as if it were an afterthought, "that starts with a T. But I need more of it this time. As much as you can get." Harry was so frozen in terror, watching those dangerous metal appendages of Ock's moving around sinuously, hypnotically, that it took a moment for him to process what it was that Ock was referring to. "More tritium?" Ock nodded. Harry's voice rose an octave as he demanded, "Are you crazy?" Doc Ock's expression indicated that this might not have been the best of questions to ask, but Harry was hardly in a state of mind to mince words. "I already took a chance on you and you created a disaster. You're a homicidal maniac." Without a word, Ock sent two of his tentacles snaring forward, grabbing Harry by either ankle. For a heartbeat, the terrified young man thought he would be ripped in two like a wishbone. What actually transpired wasn't much of an improvement, as he was whipped high into the air and suspended upside down past the balcony. Harry hung there, terrified. "Wait!" he cried out with a remarkable cheer under the circumstances. "I could use a homicidal maniac." He took a breath and continued. "We'll make a deal. Kill Spider-Man and I'll give you what you need." Slowly, Doc Ock brought Harry back from his precarious, dangling situation and dropped him on the floor. "It seems we have a common interest. But don't you read the papers?" he asked derisively. "Spider-Man appears to have given up the ghost. They say he's quit. Some even say he may be dead already." "I don't believe that any more than you do," said Harry. "It's a trick, that's all. Either a trick by Jameson, who'd crucify his mother to sell a few newspapers, or a trick by Spider-Man to throw everyone off the track. But he's out there. I can feel it." Harry had been looking out toward the city, but now he stared at Ock. As demented as it sounded, he realized he was talking to the one man in all the city who could actually understand what was going through his head. The irony that this kindred spirit was a lunatic slipped right past him. "Yes, in my heart, in my gut, I can feel it." "As can I," Ock agreed. Insanely, the tentacles seemed to nod as well. On second thought, Harry told him, "Don't kill him. I'll never have any sort of closure if this ends like this, with the chance of me never seeing him again. Bring him back to me, alive. Do that, and I promise you can have all the tritium you want." "How do I find him?" The answer came from Harry's lips before he could stop it. "Peter Parker," he said. Ock looked surprised, and yet somehow not. "Parker? Little Mr. Know-It-All?" Harry would have grabbed the words back out of the air if he could, but it was too late to do anything but see it through. He nodded. "He takes pictures of Spider-Man for the Bugle. Make him tell you where he is." "Have it ready," snarled Ock, referring to the tritium. "I'll be back." With that Schwarzenegger-esque advisement, Doc Ock turned and clomped down the side of the building. Harry, flushed with guilt and determined to salvage something of this debacle, ran to the railing and called after him, "Don't hurt Peter! He's my best friend!" A tentacle waved over Ock's shoulder, acknowledging the caution. But Harry had no idea whether that meant that he would abide by it, or was dismissing Harry with a gesture that boded ill for the safety of Peter Parker, his helpless friend. Chapter 19. Peter Parker wasn't supposed to be depressed. This was, after all, the post-wall-crawler part of his life. The guilt-free part where his heart beat serenely in his chest, no longer shrouded in a veil of misery. The part where the specter of Spider-Man had been permanently exorcised. So he had no idea why he was wandering through the nighttime city, peering wistfully at the skyscrapers he once ricocheted off, while around him the world went on about its business. An oncoming taxi blew its horn at him as he crossed the street, slamming to a halt a few feet away. He didn't even acknowledge it, but simply kept on walking, drawing his coat tighter around him against the cold. He glanced at a newspaper on the newsstand as he passed. The banner headline proclaimed, "Crime in City up 75%. In smaller printing, a subheading read, "Some ask, where is Spider-Man?" Yeah, some. The bitter or the frustrated or the malcontents. The people who had never had anything good to say about Spider-Man when he was around were now crabbing because he was gone. There was no pleasing some people. And then, even as he wondered whether he was one of the people who can never be pleased, he heard shouting and the sound of running feet. He sniffed the air, and the unmistakable smell of smoke wafted toward him. People were running past him, and he didn't follow them so much as allow himself to be caught up in the movement of the crowd. Then he saw what all the hubbub was about. A storefront was ablaze around the corner, flames licking the night sky. What sort of store it might have been was impossible to tell, because the glass had already burst away from the inferno within. There were several floors of apartments above the storefront as well, and smoke was pouring from several of them. People were milling about in the crowd, screaming out a veritable laundry list of desperation. One woman cried out that her father was still inside, while another was positive there was a kid on the second floor. It had been so easy to ignore the howls of distant sirens when Peter could simply turn his back and walk away without knowing what it was he was avoiding. But this was right in front of him, and instinct took over. He started to dart away and yank open his shirt when he suddenly remembered his costume was in the possession of J. Jonah Jameson. Spider-Man no more. Alright, fine. But he was still Peter Parker. That would never change, and Peter Parker had to do something. A homeless woman was crouched nearby, watching the blaze, and she had a ratty blanket wrapped around herself. Peter scooped it up and threw it over his head to provide some protection from the smoke and flames, and rushed in through the front door, keeping the blanket over his nose and mouth. He squinted out from under the blanket, counting on his spider sense to help him maneuver, praying that it hadn't deserted him along with the rest of his abilities. He sprinted up to the second floor, suffocating heat pressing at him from all sides. He heard screams, cries for help from all around. "Watch it! It's the Green Goblin trying to trick you again!" He shrugged away the ridiculous notion as he kicked open an apartment door and was greeted with a wave of billowing smoke. He dropped to the floor, remembering that it was what one was supposed to do. Heat rose, but the oxygen might still be collected close to the floor. Even if he didn't have his spider powers to aid him, at least his scientific knowledge might see him through. He crawled along the floor, thick black smoke billowing around him, and he was able to make out someone through the haze. It was a child, face so smeared with dirt, hair so singed Peter couldn't even determine that if it was a boy or a girl. It didn't matter. He scuttled forward and grabbed up the child under his arm like a football. Still keeping low to the ground, he sprinted for the door since flames were blocking the window. From above him he heard timber starting to break, and screams from what seemed far away. He couldn't think about them. He was out of time. The rest of it was a blur. He was operating purely on adrenaline, instinct, and barely contained terror. All he knew was that suddenly he was out the front door, coughing and choking and hoping to God that his lungs didn't collapse. He nearly dropped the child, and then someone was hauling the child from his arms, calling out a name, Leslie, which didn't do much to solve the question of the kid's gender. Someone grabbed the blanket away from him, and he realized it was the homeless woman who complained that he had gotten it covered in soot. Peter mumbled an apology as sirens rang in his head, and then he nearly blacked out. By the time he came to his senses again, he was breathing in oxygen through a mask held up to him by a paramedic. He blinked away the remaining confusion in his head and looked around, watching the hive of activity surrounding him. The firemen had arrived and were pumping water into the blaze, bringing it under control. Ambulances were there as well, some heading away from the scene at high speed, sirens blaring. "Just take it easy, fella," said the paramedic. "We'll get you to the hospital, have you checked." "I'll be fine," Peter whispered hoarsely. You don't have to. With the amount of smoke you took in, you bet your ass we have to, replied the paramedic firmly. He placed the oxygen mask back over Peter's mouth. A passing fireman patted him on the back. You got some guts, kid, he told him. Apparently, folks in the crowd had pointed out Peter as being the heroic idiot who had dashed into the flames to save a child. Peter tried to bob his head in acknowledgement, but even that small gesture hurt. Another fireman approached the one who had just spoken to Peter, and Peter overheard him say in a low voice, "Some poor soul got trapped on the 4th floor. Never made it out." Never made it out. The words stayed with Peter all the way to the hospital. There they gave him a clean bill of health and hailed him as a hero while simultaneously telling him he should never do anything so foolish again, because he'd been exceptionally lucky. It didn't matter. His heroism didn't matter to him. His good fortune didn't matter to him. Nothing mattered except the unknown individual on the 4th floor whose life had ended this night. And Peter hadn't been able to do a damned thing about it. But Spider-Man might have. Spider-Man could have moved faster. Spider-Man could have accomplished more. Spider-Man could have gotten the job done. So, was that it? All the way home he mulled it over and over, and still he couldn't come up with an answer that was acceptable. Either he had to be Spider-Man or deal with the guilt that came with every person whom he didn't save. Was the price of great power not only great responsibility, but an incessant sense of culpability as well? He couldn't do everything, not even as Spider-Man. He couldn't be everywhere, accomplishing everything. He was still a man, not a god. Back at his apartment, he stood at his window, going over and over the day's events and staring out at the night, wondering if he would ever know peace. Tears welled up unwanted in his eyes. He turned and looked at the picture of Uncle Ben and Aunt May on his dresser. His imaginings had been free of his uncle ever since he'd left the costume behind. It had been such a relief. Now, though, he felt as if he wanted him back. As if he could never come to any sort of resolution if he couldn't square it with Ben face to face. Am I not supposed to have what I want? He asked. What I need? The picture stared at him mutely, offering no response. Every muscle in his body felt sore. He could barely move, could barely think. He flopped down onto the bed and closed his eyes. What am I supposed to do? There was a light tap at the door. He didn't even hear himself say, "It's open." Using a mental crowbar, he pried open his eyes and saw Ursula, the landlord's daughter, standing there. For a wild moment, he imagined that she would open her mouth and her father's harsh cry of "Rent!" would emerge. She said nothing, nor did he. A long moment of silence passed between them. Then she smiled. "Would you like a piece of chocolate cake?" she asked, her eyes limpid. The question was so utterly out of left field that the only thing Peter could think to say was, "Okay. Glass of milk?" He nodded. She bounced lightly on the balls of her feet and sprinted away to get them. "My life is too weird for words," he said. Ursula sat on the edge of the bed, eating a slice of chocolate cake, which, she proudly informed him, she had baked herself completely from scratch from a mix. He had wisely chosen not to point out the inherent contradiction in that. He had, however, opted to sit at his desk and eat his slice, since he hardly needed to have Dickovich burst into the room and discover his daughter and Peter together on the bed. However innocent the truth of the situation might be, it would pale compared to the insinuation. At the moment, his landlord just wanted his rent. He certainly didn't need the landlord wanting his head on a platter as well. "Thank you," said Peter with genuine gratitude as he finished eating the cake. She shrugged as if it were no big deal. To her, it might very well not be. To him, it meant a hell of a lot. When they were done, she picked up his plate, put it atop hers, and took the glass. She smiled once more. He nodded in return, and wondered if this is what Aunt May was like when she was a teen. About to step out of the apartment, she clearly remembered something. "Oh, you had a message. Your phone just kept ringing and ringing. You don't have an answering machine, I guess." When he shook his head, she shrugged and continued. "My dad was getting cranky about it because the walls are, so thin, so I came up here and answered it for you. I hope you don't mind." She extended a piece of paper, and for an instant he thought, hoped, prayed it was Mary Jane. "Your aunt," said Ursula. Oh well, could have been worse. Could have been Jameson. He took the message from her and read it. Well, it made sense. Ursula had given him a brief oasis of tranquility, so it was only natural that she would be the messenger who would shatter it. Chapter 20. Peter would have been at his aunt's first thing in the morning. Unfortunately, he fell asleep on the subway. By the time an annoyed conductor had awoken him, lest he wind up in the train yard, Peter was all the way at the Union Turnpike terminal point and had to wait for a return subway to Forest Hills. By the time he arrived, boxes of carefully labeled cartons dotted the front lawn. Some kid Peter didn't recognize was helping Aunt May with the moving while she continued to put labels on those boxes that weren't already marked. "What's going on?" Peter said with obvious concern. "They gave me another few weeks," she told him. "I decided the hell with it. I'm moving on. I found a small apartment." "Why didn't you tell me?" She just shrugged. "I'm quite able to take care of things. And Henry Jackson across the street is giving me a hand, and I'm giving him $5. Peter watched in surprise as the boy continued to hoist boxes around. Last he remembered, Henry Jackson was the kid who sped around on his big wheel and had a knack for getting under people's feet when they were walking. "That's Henry Jackson?" She nodded. "Funny what happens in 2 years. 9 years old. Great ambitions." He braced himself, hoping that his next words wouldn't cause a torrent of tears or angry words. "Listen, Aunt May, about the last visit of mine." To his surprise, she waved it off dismissively. "Oh, pish-posh, we needn't talk about it. It's water over the dam, or under the bridge, wherever you like it." Her voice cracked from emotion, though, with her next words. "You made a brave move, and I'm very proud of you. And I thank you, and I love you, Peter, so very, very much." She embraced him then, and all he could think of was his earliest days when he'd regarded her with suspicion and uncertainty, and all he wanted was his mother back. Now he realized, for perhaps the first time in his life, that his mother had always been there, incarnated in the form of this elderly woman who was determined to do the right thing, no matter the cost. "Thank you, Aunt May," he said. Then, looking over her shoulder, he suddenly said, "Hey, where are all my comic books?" "Oh, those dreadful things. I gave them away." He moaned inwardly as Henry moved out of the house to the back steps. "I put the pans in the box, Mrs. Parker," he called. "Thank you." "Hi, Peter," he said, waving. "Hi, Henry. You're getting tall." "Tell you what, Henry, will you pack those cookbooks in with the mixer?" Henry bobbed his head and said, "Okay." But he was still looking at Peter. "You take Spider-Man's pictures, don't you?" Peter shrugged. "I used to." "Where is he?" "Henry and I agree that we don't see his picture in the paper anymore," May said. Peter suddenly became very interested in the tops of his shoes. "He quit." "Why?" asked Henry, moving toward them, looking confused and even a bit disappointed. "Wanted to try other things." "Will he be back?" Peter shook his head and spoke the simple truth. "I don't know." "Oh." Henry went back to the house, looking considerably less perky than he had moments earlier. "You'll never guess who he wants to be," said May, and rather than giving him the chance to guess, said, "Spider-Man." Peter was dumbfounded. Why? She continued to pack as she said, "He knows a hero when he sees one. Too few characters out there flying around like that, saving old girls like me. And Lord knows kids like Henry need a hero. Courageous, self-sacrificing people, setting examples for all of us." He couldn't believe she was saying it. He knew, of course, that he had saved Aunt May, but so often the things he tried to accomplish, no matter how noble his intentions, seemed to be distorted so that he ended up looking like a creep. Altruism was twisted into selfishness, heroism into villainy. He'd just assumed that Aunt May harbored ill will towards Spider-Man. It never occurred to him that she might hold him in such high regard. Now she was rearranging plates inside a box, presumably so they wouldn't break upon transport. Everybody loves a hero. People line up for them, cheer them, scream their names. And years later tell how they stood for hours in the cold rain just to catch a glimpse of the one who taught them to hold on a second longer. I believe there's a hero in all of us, who keeps us honest, gives us strength, makes us noble, and finally allows us to die with pride, even though sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most, even our dreams. Oh my God, she knows. She knows she knows. She's talking to him through me, to me, but she couldn't. There's no way. She turned from the plates and faced him again. There was nothing in her expression to give the slightest indication that she thought she was talking to anyone other than her nephew. It didn't make the words any less sincere, though, nor any less meaningful. Spider-Man did that for Henry, and he wonders where he's gone. Henry needs him. Then she pointed at a piece of furniture and said, "Can you lift that desk and put it in the garage for me, Peter?" Okay, he said, feeling as if he'd had an anvil dropped on him. "But don't strain yourself," she cautioned. "I'll be right back." She headed toward the house, calling, "Henry, don't forget the recipe box." He watched her go, shaking his head. As he walked over to the desk, he considered the fact that he'd been so certain seeing Aunt May now would be torture, that she would blame him for all of her current strife. He'd braced himself for it. Instead, not only had she let him off the hook, she tossed the hook away, and lauded the accomplishments of Spider-Man besides. The only downside was that she'd given away his comic books. Gave them away? Why? He wondered as he carried the desk toward the garage. He was so distracted that it wasn't until he was halfway back there that he suddenly realized he was toting the heavy oak desk with one hand and not feeling the weight in the slightest. 8 stories up in the heart of New York City, Peter stared at the 20-foot chasm that stretched between himself and the next rooftop. It was a space he had vaulted with ease, back when he was dressed in red and blue. Now, though, his heart was pounding like a trip hammer. He kept telling himself that his strength was back, that there was no reason his other abilities shouldn't be either. That he'd been like a home run hitter who had been lost at the plate for a while, that was all. A frustrated slugger swinging at pitches in the dirt. He hadn't actually lost the ability to knock balls out of the park. He just needed to do something dramatic to find his stroke again. Well, this was pretty damn dramatic, all right. On the other hand, if he was wrong, he was about to commit suicide. It'd certainly solve all my problems, he thought morbidly. And then he resolved to push all such thoughts right out of his head. Instead, he closed his eyes and muttered, "Strong focus on what I want." Just as the doctor had told him. He visualized himself covering the distance with ease, rather than falling screaming to his death. His mind was a computer, downloading a file, and reality would be the printer onto which he would print it out and actualize it. So much for dramatic analogies. He drew back as far as possible from the edge of the roof, then started to run. Faster and faster, building up speed, building up confidence, starting to feel like his old self. And just as it happened in the fight with Flash Thompson, that day when his powers had first kicked in, the world around him slowed almost to a crawl. His environment became ice, and he was a skater gliding across it. He got to the edge of the roof, and there was no hesitation as he hurled himself into the void. His pulse was slow and relaxed, his breathing steady. Gravity? As Aunt May would say, pish-posh. Gravity was of no relevance to him as he sailed across the gap between roofs, feeling every iota of his power coursing through his veins. It was at that point that gravity, offended by his audacity, decided to show him who was boss. Realizing with growing horror that his arc wasn't sufficient to clear the distance, Peter Parker emitted a high-pitched scream. Then he dropped like a ballast bag tossed from a balloon, flailing his arms about, trying to find something to grab onto. He lucked out and snagged a clothesline on the way down. It snapped at one end, but the other held, and he swung the rest of the way across the divide. Shirts and undergarments covered his face, and he couldn't see a damn thing, which is why he slammed full face into the brick wall. He hung there, jockey shorts draped over his head, a brassiere looped around his chest. "Oh, darn," he muttered weakly. "Me without my camera. Jameson would have paid double for this shot." Chapter 21. Jameson, John Jameson, was stretched out on a couch in Mary Jane's apartment, his hands folded behind his head. He was in his stocking feet, thanks to Mary Jane's loud admonition of shoes off the couch. Otherwise, he was wearing sweats and a NASA t-shirt that read 0G Whiz. Mary Jane was lying on the floor, filling out an invitation list, with a tall stack of invitations at her side. John was busy studying a travel magazine. Then he lowered it and watched her motoring through the invites. "MJ," he said, "are you at all concerned that we're moving too fast?" "We're sitting still, John. Not a lot of moving going on." "No, I mean," he nodded toward the invitations. "Most people take months, sometimes even a year or two to plan a wedding. And we're, plowing right into it. Dad had to pull 100 strings to get the church, the caterers, everything on such short notice. We're going at it with such a manic energy, half my friends have asked me if you're pregnant and we're trying to avoid the here comes the bride, big, fat, and wide syndrome." She propped herself up on one elbow and asked with interest, "What have the other half said?" "Well, actually there is no other half," he admitted. "They all said it." "Oh, for crying out loud," she rolled her eyes. "Can't they just accept that we're really anxious to start our life together? That's all it is?" "Yes, You just what? You can't accept it?" He took a deep breath. "I just want to make sure that you're not feeling as if we have to get married in a hurry. Because if we don't, one of us might back out. That you just want to do it to get it over with. Or because you're not really sure, or there's something you feel you need to prove to someone, or..." "John, that's silly." "Is it?" "Yes," she said firmly. "I want to get married because I want to be with you. Don't you want to be with me?" "Of course." "Then that's settled." She slapped the magazine. "Go, read, plan." He nodded, feeling slightly mollified, and after another minute or two, he read aloud. "The Bahamas, 14 tropical nights that captivate your imagination and stimulate your senses." He lowered the magazine and asked, "How's that?" "Sounds good," Mary Jane said, which was exactly how she'd responded to the last 9 suggestions he'd made. Staring at the invitations, she said, "Who's Aunt Ida? It's familiar, but I can't remember when we were at the lodge on Christmas. She called us with the trifle recipe, the Gabby one. We had a Gabby recipe? She was Gabby." He smiled. "Oh, Aunt Ida," Mary Jane said, voice dripping with good-natured sarcasm. "I liked Aunt Ida. My mother's family. John told her with a resigned shrug. Actually, she drives everybody crazy. Mary Jane, sounding like the voice of experience, said, "Families can do that." John watched her out the corner of his eye as she continued working on the list. He was surprised when he saw her cross off a name with particular conviction. Wondering who could have possibly provoked the reaction, he lowered the magazine and studied the list more openly. He was mildly surprised when he saw whose name had disappeared beneath black pen strokes. "You sure you don't want to invite your friend the photographer, Peter Parker?" "Positive," she said with a finality that indicated the discussion should end. John didn't take the hint. He was someone who earned a living sitting atop thousands of tons of explosive fuel. He wasn't daunted by a candid conversation with his fiancée. "I thought he was your pal," said John. "Peter Parker is a great big jerk." "World's full of big jerks," he said in a self-deprecating manner. You'd be surprised how many big jerks end up getting the girl. She looked up from the invitations and smiled at him. "You're adorable, you big jerk." Gravely, he said, "It's the uniform," and laughed. Then he reached out to her and gently touched her cheek. She studied him closely, looking deeply into his eyes as if searching for something. "Put your head back," she told him after a moment. He frowned, puzzled, but did as she asked. He leaned far back, his head hanging over the arm of the sofa. She came around to the other side, then leaned in and kissed his upside-down face. She had never kissed him like this before. He felt as if every nerve ending were on fire. It wasn't just like they were kissing for the first time. It seemed as if this were the invention of the kiss. The first time man and women pressed lips and thought, "Oh my God, why haven't we been doing this all along?" The travel magazine slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers. She withdrew, and he gazed at her in wonderment. "Wow," he sighed. "You just put me back on the moon. Are you up there with me?" Mary Jane smiled and stroked his hair. His feeling of blissful awe slowly gave way to vague concern that something was off. "Are you up there with me?" he asked slowly. "Or are you somewhere else entirely?" She looked away from him. "I need to go out for a bit. Just be by myself. Okay?" "Sure," he said guardedly. "Do you want me to be here when you come back?" "Oh, sure," Mary Jane assured him. "Read the magazine, relax, do husband-to-be stuff." She was getting her jacket, her purse, and her voice sounded light, but in a forced way. It'll be fine. I'll be fine. Everything will be fine. I'm just, being ditzy me. Later, okay, love?" "Sure," he said, and watched as the door closed behind her. As he did so, he realized if Mary Jane were that lousy an actress all the time, she'd still be waiting tables. He looked back at the list, at Peter Parker's crossed-off name. He thought about the way Mary Jane had reacted when he'd asked about rushing into the wedding because she wanted to prove something. "Houston," he said softly, "we may have a problem." As Mary Jane sat at a table in the window of Ari's Village Deli and Bakery, she thought about what had been going through her mind when she kissed John. In the best school of method acting, she tried to recall the exact sensations that had pounded through her that night in the rain. That extraordinary night when, totally caught up in the romance of being rescued, she'd rolled Spider-Man's mask partway down and they'd kissed in a long, lingering, frozen moment of desire while he hung upside down in the alley. In many ways, her life had been upside down ever since. She sipped her coffee, glanced at her watch, and wondered how long it would take him to get here. Perhaps he wouldn't come at all. If he didn't, could she really blame him? "Hiya." She looked up. Peter was standing right there, smiling down at her. "Surprised?" she asked. "Very," he said, taking a seat. "Thanks for coming." He leaned forward, looking concerned. Are you in trouble? You might say so. She discovered she was having trouble meeting his gaze and forced herself to look him in the eyes. This feels funny. Not sure how to begin, but you know how minds do tricks on us? Tell me about it, he said ruefully. Well, mine did a real number on me, she told him. What it did was, it listened. He stared at her blankly, clearly not sure what she was talking about. It heard what you said to me after my show that night, she continued, still nervous, but beginning to grow in confidence with every spoken word. I believe it was always listening, but it refused to let me accept it until it told me to. That you were different that night. But I was afraid to trust you, and I've been thinking things through. She reached across the table toward him, and briefly it seemed as if he was reluctant to respond. But then he did, his hand grasping hers, their fingers interlocking. It was a connection being made between the two of them. Something that she hadn't even fully realized she'd lost until she discovered it again right then. And then, just like that, the connection was broken. Mary Jane jumped slightly, startled by the abruptness as Peter pulled his hand free. Listen, there's more for me to say now, he told her. Her eyebrows knit in perplexity. I maybe rushed into things. I thought I was... Her voice went cold. Wait a minute. What are you saying? I'm saying His skin was looking 3 shades of ashen. I thought I could be there for you, Mary Jane. But I can't. My mind was playing tricks, too. She wanted to kill him. She wanted to pick up the bread knife sitting between them and drive it into his chest. She wanted to strangle him with a napkin, throw coffee in his face. She wanted to scream at him, to howl that nobody yanks her around like this. Damn it, how dare he screw with her emotions? How dare he be so unable to commit that he couldn't sustain even the possibility of a relationship for longer than 30 seconds? What kind of monster was he? What sort of freak? And at the same time, she wanted to help him, to hold him, to find whatever great weight was occupying his obviously tortured mind and lift it from him. It was as if he were possessed by a malevolent spirit of misery that had briefly departed, only to come roaring back to him and seize occupancy once more, like a pestilent squatter. She wanted to know what magic words needed to be said to lift it from him forever, banish it to a realm where it could never touch him and he might therefore know happiness ever after. The warring sides of her mind collided and canceled each other out, and the only outer reflection of her inner turmoil was a single tear that ran down her cheek. She tried to keep her voice steady and barely managed to do so. Do you love me, Peter, or not? I don't, he told her in a voice that he probably imagined was firm, but lacked any trace of conviction. Then I have one more request. She paused and then said, Kiss me. Kiss you? He looked confused. Why shouldn't he be? She was. Why? I need to know something. He drew back, hesitant, and she leaned toward him. He looked afraid. Just one kiss, she said with soft insistence, friend to friend. She drew closer to him, and he to her. Suddenly, she saw his eyes go wide in what seemed unmistakable alarm. His body stiffened, and then his head was snapping back and forth in a blur like a radar dish gone amok. Before she could say anything else, before she could ask him what the hell his problem was, the plate glass restaurant window shattered and a car hurled directly at them. Chapter 22. Sometimes we have to be steady and give up the thing we want the most. When Aunt May had said that to him, Peter's first thoughts had flown to Mary Jane. If he was going to return to action as Spider-Man, if he was going to fulfill the hero's role that so many expected of him, then that meant sacrificing his life with her. That problem, however, had seemed to have been solved. Even when Spider-Man had flatly been a thing of the past, Mary Jane had made clear to him that they would never be anything more than friends. And quite possibly not even friends. Somehow that knowledge took the edge off Peter's decision. So when Mary Jane had called him, told him it was an emergency, he had gone to meet her purely in the spirit of trying to salvage their friendship. Even if they weren't to be lovers, at the very least he wanted to have her in his life somehow. He had few enough friends as it was. On the trip over, he'd wondered what the problem was. His first guess was that it had something to do with Harry. It seemed as if there was always trouble with Harry. Or perhaps she was sick, or owed money and was too embarrassed to tell her fiancé. All sorts of possibilities occurred to him. Except the one that Mary Jane confessed to him across the table in the restaurant. His first reflex was to jump for joy. His second was that Mary Jane Watson had the worst timing in the world. His third was that, no, she only had the second worst timing. Peter himself was the grand master of being out of step with the world around him. Of all the lies, all the deceits he'd perpetrated in his pursuit of trying to do the right thing, the biggest whopper he'd ever uttered was when Mary Jane had asked if he loved her. The question came at the end of a conversation that had been like a root canal of the soul. Here he had been coming on, full steam ahead, trying to win her back. And the moment she had reciprocated, then, like a sadistic puppeteer, he had cut the strings. There couldn't be any doubt. He had to seem like the biggest jerk who ever lived. The most cruel, the most insincere. He fully expected her to reach across the table, smack him in the face as hard as she could, and storm out of his life once and for all. Instead, she wanted to kiss him. Kiss him? Was she insane? Was he? He tried to pull back, knowing that if he kissed her, that would be it. It was all over. The lyrics of the Shoop Shoop song flittered through his mind. If she wanted to know if he loved her so, it would really be in his kiss. Cloth might mask his face, but there was no way he could mask his heart through that sort of intimate contact. He clenched his hands under the table, trying to will himself away from there, and yet he stayed rooted to the spot. She drew nearer, and the scent of her perfume, of her, was so thick he thought he would drown in it. Abruptly, the world slowed to a crawl, but it wasn't because of Mary Jane. His spider sense was kicking in. Instinctively, he looked this way and that, snapping his head around. Mary Jane seemed frozen in time, a perplexed look on her face that was almost comical, and suddenly there it was. He didn't need spider sense to see it. A blind man could have seen it. A car was rocketing through the air, straight toward the plate glass window, and Peter's first thought was that some driver had lost control of the vehicle. Two things disabused him of that. First, there was no driver. Second, the car was angling downward. Someone, or something, had thrown it. For Peter Parker, thought was action. He dove for Mary Jane the split second that the car came crashing through the window. He grabbed her up, moving so quickly that MJ still seemed frozen to him, and at that same instant spotted a waitress paralyzed in fear as the vehicle careened toward her. With Mary Jane slung under one arm like a sack of laundry, Peter brought his free arm up and squeezed his fingers into his palm without thinking. There was no time for second guessing, no moment to remember that he'd had trouble spinning webs before. Lives other than his were on the line, and dwelling on his personal difficulties was just unaffordable luxury. As easily as if there'd never been a problem at all, a ball of webbing fired out from his wrist and struck the waitress, knocking her off her feet and away from the oncoming car. Peter had accomplished the feat while still in midair. Now he slammed to the ground with Mary Jane and desperately rolled to the side, just avoiding having the car's back tire run over his face. The vehicle fishtailed and then crashed to a halt at the back of the restaurant. Patrons were running around, screaming, waving their arms, and at least 2 were on their cell phones, no doubt calling their attorneys. It was fascinating to see how different people dealt with an emergency. Peter helped Mary Jane to her feet. She was looking around, dazed, clearly unsure of what the hell had just happened. In the distance, Peter could swear he heard a faint boom, and wondered if a random T-Rex had gone astray on the way to Jurassic Park. Or perhaps he'd missed a memo letting him know the Hulk was dropping by. Peter, what's happening?" demanded a befuddled Mary Jane. And then there was another impact, louder than the first. Then another. Approaching thunder? Trucks running over metal plates in the road? No, it was far too steady, too regular. There was no longer the slightest doubt in Peter's mind. It was Doc Ock, and this wasn't just any house call. He glanced around desperately, trying to find a fast way out of the restaurant. There was none. The front door was packed with frantic customers, and the rear exit was blocked by the car. Peter held Mary Jane closer, and suddenly a fire hydrant directly in front of the restaurant was smashed aside. Water geysered up from it, and then a tentacle ripped aside what was left of the restaurant wall. There went any faint hope on Peter's part that Ock's presence here was merely coincidence. Doc Ock looked down from on high like a malevolent dark god, held suspended there by his tentacles. "Peter Parker," he fairly purred. "And the girlfriend. Took my advice, did you? Let me guess. The poetry did the trick, right?" Mary Jane gaped at Peter. "You told me you'd been reading poetry. Because he suggested it?" "He wasn't nuts at the time," Peter said defensively, and then he winced. "No offense, Doctor." "The truth hurts, but I endure," said Ock sadly. How did you know you were here?" Ock grinned down at him. "My babies are multi-talented. This entire city's communication system lives and dies on fiber optics, which my tentacles are easily able to plug into." "You tapped my phone line?" When Ock nodded, Peter felt his cheeks flush with anger. "How could you, Doctor?" "I beg your pardon? You said it yourself. Nuts, remember?" He pointed at himself, and his smile grew wider. "Once I knew for certain you were home, I was going to come and find you. But then this little lady called. When you made your date, I knew I couldn't let the opportunity pass." "What opportunity?" asked Peter, trying to figure out some way to cope with this disaster that wouldn't advertise his secret to the world. "What do you want?" A tentacle snapped out. Peter could have dodged it, but the speed required for that would certainly snare Ock's attention, leading to questions that Peter really didn't want to have asked. So he let it grab him around the neck, yanking him closer to Ock's face. "I want you to find your friend Spiderman," he said tightly. "Tell him to meet me at the West Side Clock Tower at 3 o'clock. "I don't know where he is." Doc Ock looked unimpressed by Peter's claim. "Find him, or I'll peel the flesh," he nodded toward Mary Jane, "off her bones." "If you lay one finger on her," Peter snarled. "You'll do what?" Ock said challengingly. And suddenly Peter didn't give a damn about his secret. Doc Ock's face was only a few feet away. Peter could end the madness right here, right now. He drew back his fist, and then one of Ock's tentacles whipped around before he could move. It knocked him back viciously, sending him slamming into what was left of the back wall of the restaurant. The flying car had taken out most of its supports, and now with the impact of Peter's body, the entire structure tumbled down upon him. Seconds later, he was buried. From beneath the rubble, he heard a loud, angry string of curses come from Ock. "Perfect. Let him think I'm dead. Then maybe he'll leave me alone, and Mary Jane can..." It was at that moment that he heard a scream and a cry of, "Put me down!" from somewhere nearby. In the hazing blur that was Peter's consciousness, that voice was easy to identify. The blur cleared as Peter realized just what had happened. Doc Ock had grabbed Mary Jane and was carting her off, laughing all the while. Mary Jane? Why Mary Jane? Had Ock realized that Peter was Spider-Man and was trying to push him into action? No, that couldn't be it. Ock had all the cards and had clearly won the arms race. He had no reason to be coy. Coy just didn't work when you had 4 metal tentacles and a streak of megalomania on par with that of Napoleon. Desperately, Peter began to shove at his entombment. It wasn't easy. He felt as if he were trying to relocate the moon using a small plastic spoon. He had no clue how long it took him. Probably seconds, although it seemed as if hours were dragging past. Then he shoved aside a broken beam and realized that his hand had emerged from the pile and was grasping air. Unfortunately, he couldn't breathe through his hand. He needed to surface, and fast. He gathered his wits, his concentration, and his rapidly returning spider strength, focused, and then smashed upward. Debris consisting of 2x4s, bricks, and plaster flew in all directions. Seconds later, Peter was standing. It was a hell of an accomplishment, all things considered. His clothes were torn and his lip was bleeding. None of that mattered, though, because he realized his strength was flooding back into him. It had begun with lifting Aunt May's desk, and now all his missing strength and more was at his command. In his eyes there was the gleam of a hunter. He dashed into the street and scanned the area around the restaurant. There was no sign of either Ock or Mary Jane outside the restaurant. It didn't matter. He would find them both, because he was sick and tired of having deranged people threaten those whom he loved the most. Back in the wreckage of the restaurant, Peter found a napkin and a pen and quickly scribbled a note on the napkin before shoving it in his pocket. Nearby was a sports clothing store with a smashed-in window, courtesy of one of Ock's tentacles. A soiled ski mask lay on the ground. He fired off a web line, snagged the ski mask, yanked it toward him, and caught it easily. He pulled it over his head, thinking, "Back to basics," and sprinted toward the nearest building. There was no time to be subtle. He fired a web line, grabbed it, and sent himself flying heavenward with the confidence of old. Pedestrians had been too caught up in the destruction to notice his snagging of the ski mask, but when he launched himself toward the rooftops, it grabbed everyone's attention. There were shouts and outcries of, "That's gotta be Spider-Man!" and even, "Get him!" But he couldn't tell whether it was a call for him to nail Doc Ock or whether someone actually thought they could apprehend Spider-Man himself in some way. It didn't matter. Nothing mattered, except saving Mary Jane and putting an end to Ock's rampage. Whether Ock was under the influence of the arms or actually piloting the boat, Peter didn't care. All he knew was that Doc Ock wasn't getting away with this. Not on his watch. Ock wanted Spider-Man. Perfect. That was exactly what he was going to get. It had taken him half an hour door to door to get from his apartment to the coffee shop via subway. From the coffee shop uptown, covering 40 blocks via web, it took him 10 minutes. And that was with being cautious. He landed on the wall directly outside J. Jonah Jameson's office. Through the window, he heard Robertson and Jameson talking. "Police still have nothing on the whereabouts of your son's fiancée. Sorry, Jonah." Bad news certainly traveled fast. "It's all my fault," said Jameson. And for the first time in his life, Peter actually felt some degree of sympathy for him. Both of them were worried about Mary Jane, although for very different reasons. Still, for all the sins that could be laid at the doorstep of J. Jonah Jameson, Peter couldn't figure out how Ock abducting Mary Jane was remotely Jonah's fault. But the next words in the conversation made it clear. "I drove him away." "And he's the only one who could have stopped Doc Ock," said Robbie. Son of a... They were talking about Spider-Man. He suddenly felt like Tom Sawyer hiding in the vestibule during his own funeral and hearing all the nice things being said by everyone who had deplored him in life. He peered through the window. His costume was hanging nearby on display. Jameson, his head sagging, had his face in his hands. Robertson was next to him, his back to the costume, a hand resting on his boss's shoulder. It was perfect positioning, and would likely remain that way for perhaps a second or two. But that was all the time Peter would need. He leaned in and snagged the costume, yanking it out of the office, even as Jonah continued to eulogize him. "Spider-Man was a hero, Jonah said mournfully. I just couldn't see it. Oh man, and me without my tape recorder, thought Peter, as he pulled the napkin from his pocket and webbed it to the spot vacated by the costume. The entire process had taken less than a blink of an eye. He was already scuttling up the wall as Jonah continued. The pause was enough to telegraph it to him. Jonah must have turned around. Thief! Came Jonah's outraged bellow, confirming it. He'd discovered that his prize trophy was gone, replaced by a note that said, "Courtesy, your friendly neighborhood Spider-Man." Peter didn't slow down, continuing his climb while Jonah's howling went on at length. A criminal! He stole my suit! He's a menace to the entire city! I want that wall-crawling arachnid prosecuted! I want him strung up by his web! I want Spider-Man! As rants went, it wasn't bad. Granted, spiders weren't insects, but Peter didn't really expect Jonah to know or care about that. And since it was originally Peter's suit, questions of ownership were murky at best. But hey, Peter could be accommodating. Jonah wants Spider-Man, he thought as he pulled his mask over his head. Then he gets Spider-Man. His clothes were wadded up into a compact web sack, which he stuck in a shadowed corner of the Daily Bugle roof. He flexed his arms and legs. All the freedom of movement was still there. Even better, apparently Jonah had had it dry cleaned and professionally restored. Even those annoying blood stains had come out. It looked and felt better than new. Well, so did he. He leaped off the roof with neither fear nor hesitation, fired a web line, and sailed through the steel and glass valleys of Manhattan. He heard people shouting from below, "Take a look, overhead!" and, "Hey there! There goes the Spider-Man!" Damn straight, he thought. Okay, what kind of name is this? Algernon. It's Algernon. Ugh, his British names. They were well into the second act when Algernon, oh my god, what is that name? Ow, that was my foot. One woman cried out that her father was still inside, while another was positive there was a kid on the second floor. Point out that the inherent... I'm running on fumes here. Let's get this through. Water. Reciting the ethos of the crown jewel of comic book movies is thirsty work. How many times is this cat gonna meow and ruin a take? Odds are the microphone isn't even picking it up. Why did I do that? Then leaned in and kissed his upside down face. And everybody in the theater starts booing. I will never forget that, and I wish I had recorded it. "Houston," he said softly, "we may have a problem." Yeah, this guy knows what's up. She paused and then said, "Kiss me."
Run! Run away, Peter! She's a Taylor Swift song waiting to happen!